couldn't be portrayed negatively. They could in other countries, but not necessarily here. One of the first films to deal with it was actually based on a very successful Broadway show, which is called Detective Story, which premiered on Broadway in 1949, and the film actually came out in 51 with Kirk Douglas, and that told the story of a brutal cop, a cop who could certainly be accused of police brutality, not a corrupt cop, but a brutal cop. And it basically kind of explored what the reasons were that brought him to this brutality. So it was more of a character study, which dealt with, his father had been on the other side of the law, and he felt that his father had driven his mother crazy, and he wanted to do everything he could to stop crime and fight crime in any capacity. And he was totally uncompromising, and he could be particularly brutal also. But in exploring his psyche, it also kind of, I don't want to say it didn't make excuses for him, but you were meant to sympathize with him to a large degree.
Okay, well, could you give me the name of the movie again? Was it Police Story? Detective Story. Do you know what year?
Yes.
1951. Okay, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
The play came out in 49, and the play was with Ralph Bellamy, but in the film they used Kirk Douglas, who was a little young for the part. And the guy couldn't forgive his wife. He was a purist, an unrealistic purist about things. So whenever there was a flaw in something, he couldn't deal with it. And he even has a line, one of the great lines in the theater and probably in films, is when he talks about how he hated his father, and all the time his father was inside of him laughing. And then he said, maybe not. Maybe he was crying. Poor bastard. Maybe he couldn't control himself any more than I could.
Right.
So it did explore that, but it didn't explore systemic brutality. None of the other cops in the film were portrayed as brutal. And, there was no systemic reasons for the brutality.
Okay, so we're chalking it up to psychological deficiencies of
right.
One individual as opposed to inherent corruption or a cult of brutality. But right. He was brutal. He wasn't corrupt. He wasn't running a game. He just beat people up. Okay, great. So what other kind of, well, that's one kind of film. I know that.
Yeah.
Well, what else is there?
But after that, you still had the commissions that prevented where the cops basically had to come out as good guys. The next film, and I guess the film in 1961, which actually in a way broke through that, even though it wasn't about police corruption or brutality, but that portrayed a brutal and racist police officer, was West Side Story. I guess with me, everything comes back to West Side Story.
Wait a minute. But who's brutal?
They Lieutenant Schrank, the detective, who basically makes racist remarks about the Puerto Ricans. He was played by Simon Oakland in the film. And again, that was based on a Broadway show, obviously, but it was bold in that it was the first film to portray, one of the first films, the first major film, the first film that had a major impact on society, that portrayed the police officer without excusing him or promoting any sympathy for him at all, and obviously as portraying him as brutal and racist. And that kind of opened things up. And I think the civil rights movement also opened it up, because we had these obviously, corrupt, brutal, and racist cops down south. We also saw what happened with Bull Connor, and that opened it up a little bit more. Robert Wise and Jerome Robbins and Ernest Lehman, the screenwriter of the film, even though they had to change words, did make sure that was in there. They fought against the trend, against the tide. And
what movie?
I'm still talking about West Side Story.
Oh, okay, but that was a minor character.
That was a supporting character.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
did
It's like the guy who's running the grocery store and
right,
the asshole cop. But it
right.
wasn't
Well,
like it wasn't even up to
Are you
Officer
talking
Krupke.
about, excuse me, are you talking about Officer Krupke?
No.
we're talking about Lieutenant Schrank. Officer Krupke was assisting Lieutenant Schrank.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, and he was. I mean, he was particularly racist and bad. Schrank was. Officer Krupke was what the song was about, and it fed into what the film and the play were trying to say. But it was a bold move. Whereas, in the remake, Steven Spielberg is catering to popular sentiment. Robert Wise and Jerome Robbins and Ernest Lehman went against popular sentiment and showed the truth about a lot of cops. And there was even a hint that it might be systemic in the film. But again, the film was not specifically about police corruption. You'd have to go probably, there were a couple of films, but to get a major, film that had an impact on society, you'd probably have to, you had films about the civil rights movement, but again, they weren't specifically about the brutality of the police in the overwhelming majority of cases. I think one of the next breakthrough films as far as police brutality and corruption, particularly corruption, was Serpico, which of course was based on the actual case, and that was in the 70s. So it took a little while, even though even after the breakthrough of the 60s, when the blacklisting and the commissions didn't have as much control and things started opening up in the West Side Story era and afterwards, it still took a while before they actually had a film that dealt primarily and specifically and totally with police corruption and police brutality. And then after that, of course, everything opened up. Okay, the studio system had basically, as it had been known before, had ended. It was dying down in the late 50s, and so when all this stuff started opening up, it took time. It took time. But because of little breakthroughs like West Side Story, and if you go back in Detective Story and little things like that, well, not little things, but I mean, they had a major impact. So Hollywood was at least willing to deal with it. And starting with Serpico, then you started having films about police brutality and police corruption. You also had films like the Dirty Harry series and to a large extent the French Connection, which almost tried to justify the brutality, not the corruption. So basically, it really, everything, most of the films about police brutality and corruption, the ones that impacted society, aside from the ones I mentioned, happened really in the 70s, starting in the 70s.
Okay.
That's just historical background there.
Okay, good. All right. So Dirty Harry, well, he didn't actually ever hit anybody or something, but he didn't always give people their complete legal rights. He was,
Exactly.
he was making fun of that, how the departments are going soft. But he never did anything. He never, went psycho or anything, except he gives somebody an opportunity to get shot. And oh, you feel lucky today, So you knew where his attitude was, but he never technically broke the law as a character, I don't think.
Well, he shot first and asked questions later. It's just the way the film portrayed it is everybody he shot was committing a crime. Whether or not they're worthy of being shot is a whole other thing.
Yeah.
But that was on the other side. The French Connection too. I mean, the heroes, particularly the Eddie Egan character, Gene Hackman played, could be brutal and rough and but again, not corrupt. So
okay.
The brutality, but not the corruption necessarily.
Okay, so let me ask you a question, Michael. Have you seen the updated, I think it's HBO Detective Series? They make like a series, 10-episode series, and they do it once every 3 or 4 years. And the last one was about two cops. One had Dennis Hopper in it. Not Dennis Hopper, the other guy, the names are gone. Have you seen any of those HBO series?
No, I haven't seen the HBO series. Of course, that's television. But no, I haven't seen it. I've heard some rumblings about it, but you have several films, I mean, that deal with, if not brutality, corruption, at least one of the other, sometimes both. You have films like Training Day and things like that. These are all recent films. And recently, in the past 20 years, films have been dealing with it more and more. And I think that opened up in the 70s, not just because of, the Schrank character in West Side Story or Serpico. I mean, there were things going on in society. The civil rights movement helped us address it simply because we knew from that there were loads of brutal, corrupt cops and racist, obviously, cops down south and in the north, all over the states. And then again, the late 60s and the anti-establishment movement also questioned the brutality of the police in dealing with the anti-war protesters, the anti-Vietnam War protesters in the late 60s. That also, these were societal events that actually opened the door and allowed Hollywood to deal with these issues without risking audience attendance.
Okay, let's go to Jim and let's see, what do you got on film that covers, brutal or corrupt police?
Well,
and more, not in a tangential way,
all right.
but an actual.
First of all, I don't agree with Michael that it starts much earlier. It starts with silent film. People have to remember that the context of cinema is growing and developing in the midst of like major cleanups of police departments around the country, particularly in New York City. There was a huge commission in the 1890s called the Lexow Commission, which concluded that the police department of the city of New York was extorting $10 million a year from the public in the 1890s, which of course you multiply that's a lot of money in these days. And of course that led to Theodore Roosevelt being the person to reform the police department. Now, they did not hesitate to close down theaters anywhere in the United States because they felt that morals were being attacked. So in 1908, the New York City Police Department closed all the theaters in New York. They made a big deal politically about that. And in 1910, the International Association of Police Chiefs condemned Hollywood for making and portraying films that made cops look like idiots. So, for example, they were very opposed to the Keystone Cops. They were opposed to how Charlie Chaplin, later in his, particularly his movie Easy Street in 1917, where he basically had his tramp was turned into a cop. And the only way he was able to save the girl from criminals was he accidentally sat on a needle, a drug addict's needle, and became sort of like Popeye the Sailor Man, became like superpowers. So they were very much opposed to how Hollywood was making them look like in the 1910s. They had little shorts. They had police dog shorts that were very popular. They had a police dog called Officer Piffles. And Officer Piffles would piss off the police departments of the United States because basically he showed the police completely inept from being able to do anything. And Officer Piffles was a dog and he was able to solve the problem. So they actually made a political issue about this. Now, if you had fast forward to the 20s and the 30s, especially let's look at the early 30s, we had this big reaction to how people were responding to the Depression and the fact that the media was giving a tremendous amount of attention to gangsters. And so you had a big battle going on in Hollywood about gangster movies. Sort of, like the initial movies with Paul Muni playing Al Capone. And there was a big reaction in Hollywood to this and stringency put in to them so that, for example, the famous movie where James Cagney decides to, at the end of the movie, not be the tough guy. And basically, he's pleaded by his, I forget who plays the priest.
It's no, I think it was Patrick O'Brien. It's the Roaring 20s. Roaring 20s.
Patrick O'Brien plays the priest. And then he decides to morally punk out at the end, and he decides to go to the death chair like as a coward because they want to have this moral example to the youth. Well, that was a big deal. And so, the police departments were sort of making a big deal. Now, you got to then bring in Mr. Jack Webb. Because Jack Webb actually starts doing this Dragnet series a lot earlier than just the early 50s when he actually, does this. And he's working very closely with Parker in the LAPD police department. So they wanted to basically have a vision of the police force as a stabilizer of society made up of honest men dedicated to keeping the bad guys in their place. And so Dragnet is a mass popular kind of TV show. And in the midst of all that, it's sort of hilarious. The same year that Dragnet premiered, you had a major incident where LAPD attacks 5 Latino men and breaks their bones and puts them in the hospital. So the question of, now I guess the other issue is to talk about film noir, because you start to have, at least in popular culture, and certainly in the film noir that you begin to see, you'll have law enforcement sometimes as the ally of the renegade detective. Certainly you see that in Humphrey Bogart films of the 40s. But then you also see a darker sensibility about how law enforcement is portrayed. And I think that you start to see it sort of alter in the ways that Michael was talking about. Now, obviously, the films he cited are quite dramatic, and they do indeed break paths. I would say that, the Hill Street Blues and The Wire, of course, when it debuts in 2002, is, we're sort of heading and going fast forwarding. But, the police, of course, were always portrayed in a popular sense. Look at the Dirty Harry movies. Those movies were sort of made as a synonymous for Law and Order at the time when the first Dirty Harry movie comes out, and then he's sitting there with his 44 and saying, hey, punk, you have to think about whether I have a round in here or not. And if you do, like I'm going to blow your shit away. Well, that was sort of the impetus. Now, Serpico, of course, is a really powerful film that is based on fact. I know growing up in New York, I would watch the Vice Squad in the neighborhood I lived in come in regularly for their bag. I used to watch the bag man of the 6th precinct in the West Village come in and pick up the money every Friday at a restaurant I worked in. So I was very aware. And he was a charming old Irishman. He'd come in and he'd sit there and, he'd pick up the payoffs at the gay bars in the West Village too. So there was real corruption in front of your face. And, I watched, I knew a friend of mine when he came back from Vietnam, the first thing out of his mouth was, I want to become a cop so I can get into corruption. I want to make money. I want to, he said, he was violently going through his episodes, big guy, 6'5", and he would get into bars and have big fights. And then he said, well, Jim, I'm going to apply for the police department so I can get on the corruption. And then eventually he said, the hell with it. He re-upped and went off to Vietnam a second time. But, so there's this picture of the police, of course, that does indeed get affected by the 50s and the 60s. I think that famous TV series that was on TV, what is it called? Michael, the one I'm talking about. In the late 50s, it was sort of a grim detective drama, Naked City.
Oh, yeah. Naked City. 8 million stories.
Right. Naked City begins.
But that wasn't anti-police.
Well, but the question of a sensibility. It wasn't anti-police, but it was sort of like grim police. Here's grim police in action.
Frustrated. A lot of frustration.
And they're the sort of, you can't. And remember, we're like the Law and Order themes of the 60s was that, let's defend police officers. And police officers, when it comes to public polling, they're held in greater esteem than Congress and certainly the media. Forget about it. So, look at how we extol, you'll hear the Republicans, whenever they, or even the Democrats too, like whenever they have confront a first responder, it's always like, you're the great hero, you're this, you're that. And police officers, I knew someone who was actually a young black female police officer. She was involved in one of the great scandals out in Queens when the whole precinct was busted for payola. And I knew one of the lead detectives in a precinct in East Harlem. He was the heavyweight boxing champion of the European Theater of Operations. So he would go in the basement, and whenever he collared somebody, he said, "If you can kick my ass, I'll free you." And of course, they never kicked his ass. So, so cops have this sort of, feeling that they can get home free. Whereas in reality, Serpico, I think really, the Knapp Commission, I think really put the kibosh on how police were in reality. And then you start to have a lot of follow-ons about that. And certainly if you look at police shows after that, The Wire is the best example. I have seen the detective series you're referring to, Ken. So they're very grim, and usually they involve, one of the detective series was set in the South, and it involved, apprehending a serial killer. So the police sort of get a pass on serial killer movies when, they're actually trying to apprehend them. But I think that the corruption issue is something like Training Day was an incredible film with Denzel playing that LAPD corrupt cop. And, and the reality is that goes on. So Lex, you have constant great material to just keep on pumping these films out. And there's no end to how Hollywood handles this issue.
Right. I just wanted to follow up on that. The Magnum Force, 1973, Clint Eastwood, was about 5 cops who formed a vigilante squad to just assassinate the big criminals, whoever. And he, he was catching them. He went against them, and there's a big shootout at the end.
Oh.
But this was a racist, squad, like white supremacists, or Aryans, but that's 1973. And and then one other movie I've got to point out, which, this is late in the game, 1990, called Internal Affairs.
Yeah, that was a great film.
Great film, Richard Gere and Garcia,
Right, but
Andy Garcia. But it was late in the thing. But here's a guy, completely corrupt guy, right? And the thing that brilliance, I think, of that film was the casting, because Richard Gere did not have to extend himself too much. He's an absolute narcissist, and he's like, looks in the mirror and says, "Oh, you're so cute." So he played the part just beautifully. I thought.
Well, and remember, science fiction, of course, does cop movies. RoboCop.
Oh, right, Dredd and
RoboCop. Yeah, Dredd, and then of course we have to think about how what's happened in the past year is going to affect police depictions on television, because I remember when Cops first came out, I used to sit there and watch it with my late sister.
Oh yeah, cops,
and she would laugh, because she would recount how they're violating Miranda. They'd arrest somebody, wouldn't even give us Miranda rights, etc. Well, they canceled that because of the George Floyd issue. And then you've got issues of how Law and Order is going to evolve, and I believe there's a show called Brooklyn 99 that had to be rewritten. It hasn't been reissued, but they had to rewrite it because how they're going to deal with the whole issue of George Floyd. So, it's a very interesting topic to explore, and, let's keep talking about it.
Okay. I just looked up one thing that's interesting. There's always somebody who's actually the first person who ever said, "Well, I'll be damned," or the first person who said, "Have a nice day." So the first person who said, "Thank you for your service," was David Finkel, who is an American journalist, and it was a follow-up to a nonfiction book about good soldiers in the 2-16 Infantry Battalion in Baghdad during the 2007 and 2008, one of the Bush Wars. So it was, "Thank you for your service." And I just keep hearing that and hearing that and hearing that. And it's gone from soldiers to cops. And I'm like, he's got a job. The job is high risk, but you get to play. And what do you mean? "Thank you for your service." What about the postman? He's got to walk,
Yeah,
You know,
but see,
the postman does a lot of hard work delivering
Yeah.
the mail, and so do lots of
Kenny,
people.
Kenny, people use "thank you for your service" as a way to get off the hook. They basically go, "Oh, thank you for your service," and you know, like fuck you. Like, so okay, let's hear somebody's coming right back from Iraq or Afghanistan. Oh, thank you for your service, and then like it's sort of like a way for some guilt-ridden civilian who has ambiguities about all these things to sort of say thank you for your service, and then like, you know, does this person who thanks that guy for his service get involved with TBI problems with veterans? Does he get involved with PTSD issues? Does he go advocate for robust GI bills for these guys? No. So,
Right.
but anyway,
But I understand that. But there was a big controversy, which was in the movies, about the culpability of the soldier. Remember that this Indian lady sang a song about the universal soldier. The wars would end if nobody would pick up a gun. So it's not, you can't, how much culpability does somebody have who's like, all these movies glorifying snipers. Snipers are most like, immoral thing to a pacifist or somebody, sitting there knocking people off just because you make a decision that you got to be taken out. But anybody with a gun going out and shooting or dropping napalm or dropping bombs or operating a drone, you are on the front line. You're making the final decision. You're following orders to commit a crime. So there's always a question of the culpability of that. Personally, that's why I avoided getting into the Army, not because I'd been involved in a lot of dangerous activities and sports, but I'm not going to get in a position where somebody's going to tell me that I have to shoot that guy and don't ask why.
Well, but look at how cops are. I mean, look, I've been friends with different guys who've been. I've known
lots of good cops.
I've known cops all my life, and one thing I know, one guy said, Jim, I never had to pull out my weapon.
Right.
My whole career. Other guys I know did that, but I want to get back to the cop movies. One movie that Catherine Bigelow did, which I thought was very powerful, was her film about the Algiers motel incident in 1967, in her film about Detroit.
What was it called? I never saw it. What is it?
Detroit. And that was about when the police during the Detroit riots raided the Algiers motel and killed 3 black guys. They killed basically 12 people. And they beat up a whole bunch of other people. So like that was a big deal. And here is the ultimate, like the caricatured bad cop. But that's a reality. So, the question always is how Hollywood generally, it's like you read about how Hollywood, when they establish Hollywood, the Department of War, the Navy, they start cooperating with Hollywood right away. Well, so have police departments, because they want to see favorable depictions of the men and women in blue. They don't like these movies that basically make them look like crooks. And so that's the problem, of course, with I think what we're going to have coming out of the events of the last year. And certainly Ferguson impacted that. But we're going to see more of that I'm sure, with George Floyd. Imagine when they do a movie about George Floyd, what's going to happen.
Well, there's a theory of a certain philosopher or psychologist, social scientist, that let's say war movies, we're not talking about war movies, that you can do a movie on these issues and have a moral ending to the movie, like the brutality was wrong, the corruption finally got revealed. You could play it that it's a bad thing, or people die uselessly in wars or commit crimes that they later regret in wars. However, you're still advertising the activity. You still got, look at all this gear you carry around, and look at all of these fights. Don't you want to be able to fight like that and take these chances? It's very right in line with like the ads, for Marines or the Air Force, or get in the game, play. We never lose. They can say whatever they want, but they don't advertise and say, here, take a chance to question your integrity. Can you decide to kill somebody without any compunctions? They never give you those moral questions in those military ads. But I'm just saying that it's the theory is that let's say it's about pool, all right, playing pool. And playing pool is so cool. Now, you could show at the end of the movie that pool players just have rotten lives. Nobody loves them, and they just waste away. It doesn't matter. You're advertising the game of playing pool, and that increases the activity in that area. So the cop movies, good or bad, will increase people wanting to join a police force or security agency, or even go all the way and work for Blackstone. Isn't it Blackstone? The mercenaries.
Well,
yeah, but something, Ken,
Go ahead, Mike.
The problem is, for instance, even in pre-code Hollywood, during the silence and everything like that, rarely did films take on corruption and brutality. They may have lampooned the cops, but they didn't take on corruption and brutality. And even now, yes, with the George Floyd thing, we can say, well, I wonder how movies are going to deal with that. But then we also have the January 6th insurrection, when you actually had the police were the ones trying to, at least the Capitol Police, which were the ones trying to stop the insurrection, or were the ones being brutalized in many cases by it. So there's two edges of that sword, as far as the events that have been happening. I think that the primary thing is that in Hollywood, it's the impact these films have. I agree that when you show somebody, even if it's an anti-brutality film, but you show the brutality, it can lead to that. Although I have to tell you something, my love for shooting pool had never came from a movie. But the fact is, yes, the actual showing of the brutality, or whatever it is, the action can lead people to do it, or people might identify with those characters, even though they're being portrayed negatively. Or in the denouement of the film, they were, they get their comeuppance or whatever, which is what Code Hollywood, Hollywood during the Code times would actually, what they would have to do.
Right, but they've made movies oriented towards cheering for the villain.
yeah, but see, people go into these. But look, I don't know where you guys have been. I used to go whenever there was a cop movie. I would make sure I'd go to a movie theater in the 42nd Street area, because I wanted to hear the masses react. And boy, they got off of watching some guy get his ass kicked, no matter who the hell did it. Watching somebody shoot somebody, they love that stuff. And so, that's another element. But why don't we hear from Dennis?
Yeah, let's go to Dennis. Hey, Dennis, please unmute yourself. Let me give him a little time. There he is.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're on, Dennis.
Yeah. I don't know what you're asking me. What kind of comments you want?
We're talking about have you seen movies where the police are portrayed as corrupt or brutal?
Yes.
So what's your viewpoint on that?
They're corrupt and brutal.
So
That's what I think. I think police are they're there to defend property and property owners. That's what they're there for. And police started out with slave catchers down south in America, and slaves were property, and they would go after runaway slaves, basically. And I don't trust the police at all. But
as a class, you don't. Anybody in uniform.
as a class, I don't trust the police forces. I don't, as a institution. It is run by the same people who are using drones in the Middle East and killing people. I don't like. I'll put it another way. I don't like the capital system. There's capitalism and there's the capital system as a whole. I don't like it. And what the police are doing is defending capitalism, basically, and the capital system. And that's really what they're all about. I have never had personally problems with the police. They're always friendly with me ever since I was a little child. But I know what they do to black people. And I was in Philadelphia in the late 60s and early 70s. And I had an organization. I was working at Temple University, and I put together an organization called the Council for Social Development, which did social programs basically, and was part of the Times. And I went over to one of the townhouses where we had the organization meetings, and I walked in one day and I said, "Oh, the Black Panthers are being strip searched." They wouldn't strip search me. I might be more revolutionary than the Black Panthers, but they wouldn't do anything to me. But they would do something to the black. If the kinds of encounters I had with the police, they always backed off. They never backed off with black people. So I knew it was happening. And at Temple University, I was part of something called the Center for Community Studies. We had a big contract with the Office of Economic Opportunity. And I was actually going out in Pennsylvania and elsewhere to train community action agencies. So like all these communities had issues all over the place. But the thing is that the police were dangerous for black people. And I knew that because I had partners, colleagues in training. And one of them was really scared to go in a certain neighborhood in Philadelphia. He says, "I'm not going there," because he thought he would get beat up. I could walk there with no problem because I was white. So my thing is to always be afraid of the police, even if they're friendly with me. And even if I'm talking to them, I'm getting along with them. I think they're very dangerous, especially to whomever is getting scapegoated. I'll put it this way. The ruling class has scapegoats that keep people divided so they don't overthrow the ruling class. And people who were scapegoated in Philadelphia were black people. And this was during, the time of the late 60s, early 70s, the revolutionary period. But I didn't have any problems with the police, but my colleague did. And I'll just leave it at that. I just think they're dangerous to all of us. And if people like them, it's likely they're probably racist. That's what I would say. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And yeah, we can get into an existential, the word existential has double meanings, a philosophical discussion about how you define the need, necessity, and monitoring and governing, or governing in the sense of restraint of a security system of any kind. And then the broader thing of like what Dennis is mentioning, that the police are working as an agent for those who own property to protect it. They're there to protect the property of people who have, and from being leaned upon by people who have not. So they're working as an agent for people with assets and money, and to maintain the right to own property, but only for rich people. So that's a big philosophical thing. But I came up with another movie. I'm not even sure when it was. It must have been in the 30s, and it's called Les Miserables. And I'm just coming up for him. I'm remembering it. And there was a scene in there. I'm seeing if I could find the quote. It'll probably take me too long to find the actual video clip. But Charles Lawton is talking to Frederick March, who's playing the poor guy who eventually he went to jail for stealing a loaf of bread. And Charles Lawton chases him down. Oh, he gets out. He becomes a rich man, and so forth. And he gives somebody some silver candles or something. Somebody gave him some silver candles, and he became a rich man. And he was a stellar citizen. But Charles Lawton recognizes him, comes after him, and says he's a criminal still. And he starts screaming at the end of the movie, Charles Lawton, "You must live by the letter of the law. Good or bad, it's the letter of the law." So it's one of the first portrayals in the movies of a brutal, insane, heartless, callous police officer abusing, just the best people for the wrong reason.
You know something, Ken? Well,
Yeah.
first of all, Les Miserables is a great classic of literature. There've been several film versions of it.
Right.
And there was one in the 50s with Michael Rennie. There was one in the
But this was 1935.
right. Well, that was one of the first. I believe may have been a silent version of it also. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But remember one thing about Les Miserables and Hollywood. We're talking about Hollywood films or American or Western films, is that the bad cop was not American. It was not only not American, but it wasn't present day. So they could easily say, "Oh, well, that was back then over there.
Right.
We had these bad cops." But to deal with the issue, even if you deal in a historical sense, but to suggest that it's still happening today, that is much more that you didn't see much of either in pre-code or in the 30s or 40s during the heyday of the code. The fact is, I mean, it's really the post-war era when people started saying, okay, we've been through a depression and particularly the biggest war in history. So we want to know, people more so than before wanted to know the truth. They didn't want to see bullshit. But the fact is, and of course it took time before that even took hold, but the fact is that it's easy to say it's happening somewhere else and sometime else. It's easier to say it, and let's say you could also do it in science fiction. But I wonder how many films address the issues that Dennis was just talking about. The racism, yes, we have seen films that have addressed that. Maybe not particularly about it. I haven't seen very many films in which the primary subject of the film was racism in the police departments, particularly in the United States. And maybe that's something that the George Floyd tragedy will bring more to the fore. We certainly haven't seen many films that deal with the idea of police as an agent of protecting property first and foremost, or protecting the more well-heeled or the more controlling interests in the country. So, I mean, if anybody knows of any films in particular that deal primarily with that issue, not just as a secondary or tertiary element in the film, but primarily dealing with those issues. I don't know of very many films, if any, that dealt with those issues primarily.
Most of the dystopian movies, like not Elon Musk, I can't remember the names. They'll have the elites, the rich living
The Purge series, all the Purge movies.
Right, there you go.
Are about that, or something like, yes, you're right. The sci-fi dystopian movies deal.
The rich are living in and protected, and the military and the police keep the crowds down. Shoot a few every once in a while to keep them quiet.
But it's
Right,
science fiction.
Oh, and the Nazis. The Nazis are, they're the evil. They've taken on they're the evil force.
Well, they're the go-to.
Nazis.
They're the go-to. At least although it's changed with these crazy films that were done in the past 20 years about Nazis.
Right.
The one where they pull off an assassination of Hitler. which
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
ridiculous. But let's get back to this Les Miserables thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because that's sort of interesting. And of course, Les Miserables is a famous novel by Victor Hugo. It becomes a best-selling play. But let's look at the bad guy detective in reality, because that was based on one of the most interesting and controversial figures of policing that one could possibly ever come up with. Mr. Vidocq, Eugene Francois Vidocq, who was the head of the Sûreté. He was also known as the guy he's considered the father of modern criminology, and he's the bad guy modeled in the play, in the novel by Victor Hugo. And in reality, he was like an incredible, crazy guy. The guy fought in the French Revolution. He fought at Valmy in 1791. And then he had a sort of let's go to Jesus moment later in his life. He went through all these different crazy, he deserted. He was in combat fighting in the revolutionary armies. And then he winds up in Paris and he's arrested and incarcerated. So that's where they sort of get the idea of him. And then he decides to become a spy. But he is then released, and Napoleon actually puts him in charge of the secret police, right, under Foch. So here's this guy who then is immortalized by Victor Hugo later in literature, and he's someone who is a individual who actually is considered to be responsible for inventing modern criminology. And the first modern detective agency, and that's the reality of how policing is functioning. Now, I don't agree with Dennis when the whole, it's sort of like, okay, there's no doubt. I mean, I've read a lot of stuff about slave patrols, and to say that the American police departments or the origins of American policing is simply based on slave patrols is inaccurate. Yes, there's that influence, but to say that it comes in from Europe and then, they're sort of sitting there policing in the southern colonies slaves. Yes, the police were indeed responsible for enforcing the slave codes. Were they just primarily doing that? At least in the North, they weren't, because they were also involved in maintaining civil order. And the modern policing that we know doesn't really happen until, you have the revolution when they form a metropolitan police department in London. And that's before the American Civil War. And then the Americans copy it and create, the New York City Police Department, for example, is created. And so the Boston police departments. So it's more, and then if that's where they are associated with the corruption of the local Democratic, in the case of New York, the Democratic Party machines, right from the start. So right from the start, Boss Tweed and all that, you have the reality of corruption without, it being depicted in some sort of mythological way in cinema and et cetera. That's right from the start with the establishment of the police departments in the United States. To say that they're completely dependent on the slave patrols, I don't agree with that. Now, when you fast forward to the depictions of films in the past 20 years about police officers, again, they're dramatic action films. I think there was one where Pacino was put together with De Niro, and I don't really like De Niro.
Heat. Movie's called Heat. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it was sort of like the good cop, bad cop. Which one is gonna out the other guy? And that's sort of a theme in a lot of these movies in the past 20 years. In terms of when they want to do a bad cop movie. Now, most of the time, if you look at something on television like Hill Street Blues, well, that's a more nuanced sort of defense or different kind of multifaceted picture about police departments. NYPD Blue, the same way. Law and Order is, again, the police are vigorously investigating and bringing down to count the perpetrator. So I would say that the mass kind of messages being sent by the media are generally positive about police departments in general. It's these exceptional films that somebody gets to be able to do that sort of depict them negatively. And if I bring up The Purge, which is, like sort of right in line with an elite deciding to use the most incredibly insane methods. Once a year, everybody can go kill each other. And then, and it's looked on as reinforcing a reactionary white racist ruling class, which is right behind The Purge. Well, that's where dystopianism and science fiction can go even more bonkers on exploring these themes. I got back to The Wire. The Wire, to me, remains one of the best produced films, TV, whatever you want to say, soap operas on the issue of police and civil corruption done in the past 50 years in any kind of medium in the broadcast industry.
Right. Now, I just wanted to make a comment about, you mentioned, NYPD Blue, I think it was. There was an actor, Dennis Farina, is a short, fat guy. And the script they had is in the script.
Dennis Farina.
Dennis Farina, yeah. In the script, I don't think they ever showed it, but it was inferred, or like, you knew we're going to call on this guy. He's going to do the interview. Just close the door and leave him alone, because he would use torture to get the guy to confess so that they could rescue the girl. There's always a good motive. He's kidnapped the girl or something, kind of like the Dirty Harry thing. So there's justification for torture. But that was one, and they were giving a dark side of the police, because he's using a reprehensible treatment and brutality, but for a good cause. And of course, there was a TV series like this. I've spoken to an event and spoke to the director. I said, "How could you?" The 24 series. He'd torture somebody every episode. I think it was once a week. So he'd tie somebody up and start torturing them. So he, of course, for the noble thing to stop the explosion that would kill a lot of people, or reveal the secret of, some secret that was going to stop terrorist acts. So there's always good motivation, but, he'd go beyond the law and it would be very brutal and get away with it. So, that dark side has been coming in, but like you said, Jim, it's been more contemporary. And, or like Michael said, it's coming out now, but it hasn't been there in the film code. But I think there's, I can't really go along with the cop. There's the guy, Jimmy Dore. He's made statements on his show that, he says, "Hey, my uncle's a cop and my cousin's a cop. They're all crazy. They get it so they can have a gun and beat people up. That's why they join the police force, every single one of them." And he comes from a cop family. It's hard for most of us to consider, and I don't mean that, to consider that even 30% of the cops are basically there to get on the take and to push people around and to exert authority in an inappropriate manner, or rape people, or steal their or plant drugs, or do it because they're racist. I can't even imagine that I could tolerate that there's like 15 to 20%, but it just can't be everybody. It certainly can't be everybody. That's a question of what the percentage is, and that would depend upon the history of that department in that city.
Ken, it's obviously not everybody. There's good cops, there's bad cops. But when we dealing somewhat with what, to a certain degree with what Dennis was talking about, and we start talking about a systemic problem. There was a film that was, somewhat successful, not particularly successful, that came out several years ago, called LA Confidential, came out about 20 years ago, where it was basically, you had, two Australian stars playing LA police officers, and Kevin Spacey also playing an LA police officer. And that was an example of a film from I believe it was in the 90s, late 90s. It was Russell Crowe and Guy Pearce. And Russell Crowe was particularly brutal LA cop, but he then joins up with Guy Pearce to expose the endemic corruption in the LA Police Department itself. That was dealing with systemic corruption, even though it was totally fiction. It was done like one of these, in other words, almost a bit stylized. But there were films that were coming out that were dealing with systemic corruption, or people who were, if not doing it for themselves, the police department was working for the status quo, or the people on top. There were films. I don't think they took hold quite as much. And again, we have to remember that the film industry is, it's mostly, first and foremost, the Hollywood, at least, is about money. So if you got a film that goes against the grain, yeah, it can break through. Films like that, like, of course, I mentioned West Side Story, but there have been other films that broke through against that thing. Otherwise, Hollywood's going to go with the flow. It's going to go with the trend. And in this particular case, police corruption has been around as long as there's been police. Okay, it doesn't mean all cops are corrupt. It doesn't even mean most of the cops in a particular system have been corrupt. But if it's not systemic to that police, to that particular area, that particular city, there's still a lot of it. Police corruption has been around since the beginning. But Hollywood films have only been dealing with it spot on. It was really post-war, and when censorship started to drop down, or because a few films broke through the censorship and the existing mores. So you basically have something now where you have different types of police corruption, police brutality films, which is one that looks at it as an individual. That individual is doing it, and the individual is an exception to the rule, or one where the individual, the characters that are doing it, that are corrupt or that are brutal, are more the rule than the exception. And which films veer more in which direction. Again, even the ones that say it's the rule rather than the exception, do try to offer some hope or some possibility of changing the system or changing it so that it doesn't have to be that way. But it either deals with corruption or brutality as an isolated case, or is it part of the system? And that depends, again, as Dennis once said in previous shows, depends on the filmmaker, the point of view of the filmmaker. And it also depends upon where Hollywood, is tracking what the audience would want. Again, there are those films, the important films. I know I mentioned West Side Story, but I could also mention Serpico, or Sidney Lumet's films. There's several others that say, no, we're not going to just go with the flow, go with what the flavor of the month, the pop flavor of the month, as far as the sentiment of the audience, but we're going to tell them the truth. And those films do wind up being important, but the overwhelming majority of films, especially big budget Hollywood crowd pleasers, are basically going to play up to the audience perception at that time. So I don't know where we're going.
Well, look, Michael, they don't make movies about cop. The Departed made a lot of money. All right. Yeah. And that's because it's dealing with one of the great scumbags of all time, Whitey Bulger, who his level of corruption was working in tandem with the FBI, and he got away with it. And so, there's a part of me that, I don't really have much, look, I grew up in New York. You grew up in New York. Ken grew up in New York. Dennis did. I don't know how much interaction you've actually had with real life criminals who actually are involved in criminal organizations. I have. I don't have any. I have no empathy for them. Period. End of story. The mafia, fuck them. And I don't really romanticize them. And in terms of criminals dealing with the issue, how these issues are depicted in the African American community. Look, there was that brilliant movie about that guy who was smuggling in heroin think Denzel played the lead in the coffins of guys killed in Vietnam. That was a real story. And, so the issue of corruption and the sort of interaction with law enforcement in terms of doing this, I personally think that these kind of films, if you compare it to the overall images, this is why it's going to be interesting to see what we see coming out of the past year about how they're going to depict police officers. I would tend to think in general, they've been more or less favorable to cops. All right, in general. And the kind of films we're talking about now, Departed made a lot of money, but other films, I don't know how much money Training Day did. That'd be easy to find out. But that, of course, had Denzel Washington starring. But I would, and Serpico was a classic film. But these films come in there, and do they have an impact when we have the reality in all jurisdictions in the country, particularly starting from the 60s on in the 70s, of constant unfolding, police corruption cases all over the United States in terms of how they're being dealt with. And as opposed to that, the perception of the public that increasingly divided along racial and class lines. However, my greatest experience when I first went on a grand jury was how much the issue of Black and Hispanic retired city workers, they wanted revenge on the individuals conducting the street crime in their community. They liked indicting people on flimsy pretexts. They would indict them, and I would sit there and raise the fact, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? Like, does this guy really deserve this? And then some woman came back and said, I just talked to my husband about you last night. And you're the kind of person who is, you're like one of those people who pander to criminals. And so there's this, and again, it's not based on fantasy. It's based on the fact that there were indeed rising crimes. Look at what's going on in New York right now with all the bullshit with the rise in homicides. That's, and we had Mr. Adams basically win the primary. A cop who built his reputation on attacking racism. But then, of course, you have one of them, a guy who's, a quintessential New York politician, taking money from everybody, and a cop who's going to reinstate the units that were abolished by de Blasio that led to the shooting of Amadou Diallo in the Bronx, So he's already promised he's going to reinstate those kind of units. And look, people are concerned about safety and all that. I mean, that's like a primal kind of thing that people feel when they're in the midst of dysfunction and disintegration, which we see right now. And so, of course, they're going to call the cops. And the cops, of course, have been on strike for a year in New York. You try to get them to do something. They sit around, there's a cop I see who is a supporter of Trump, a Latino, and he always sits there and fucks with me. He sits there whenever I see him at 96th Street on Broadway. He'll say some stupid shit to me. I'll say some stupid shit to him. I said, "Oh, you still like Trump, huh? Yeah, where'd that get you, man?" And he'll throw some shit right back at me. But that's part of the milieu of what is being okay, Hollywood decides to make movies about this stuff. How are they going to depict it? How are they going to depict police moving forward right now in the context that we're seeing right now? It's I don't know. I've not been reading Variety regularly these days to sort of get a sense of what's up to be thought of to be made into a film about this. But again, someone's going to sit there and do a multi-part series of George Floyd. I'm just waiting for that to happen. And, Ferguson, I mean, there's all these things that people can make movies about. Do they do well at the box office? Interesting question. Because you're right. No. Money.
Also, there's another aspect to it. Just forgetting about the money is what's the scenario if you make a movie about any one of the incidents that motivated riots. But as soon as you get anything in the press, everybody shows up, starts burning properties. Anything about Amadou Diallo or about George Floyd. Oh, the movie wasn't good enough. Oh, you got the wrong guy to play the part. Your cast wasn't diverse enough. You're going to get friction, and
yeah.
So
But think about, we're living through a movie right now with the January 6th insurrection. How are they going to make a movie about Trump sitting there, probably getting his jollies off, watching his dumb followers attack the Congress?
Right.
I mean, and you're talking about corruption. I mean, we're living in the midst of when does it's like, Marshall McLuhan, like you always have your 15 minutes of fame. Well, it's some period of time we're living in, that's for sure.
Okay, so there's two other movies. I just want to correct one thing. The movies I was talking about on HBO are called True Detective, and HBO from I think 2016 to 2019 is about 4 series. There's each series about 7 or 6 episodes. I just looked it up and I forgot already. But those detectives were drunks and alcoholics and perverts and very questionable activities, but they still were trying to do basically good, even though they had their own flaws and their own compromises. But those are dirty cops in most of those series. And another thing was, I just remembered the scene in Rambo when they were locking him up and shaving him without just with a straight razor. So the police were being brutal and nasty there, and then kind of Southern, so making fun of him because he fought in the Vietnam War or whatever the motivation was. It really didn't hang together too well. But there was a thing about showing corrupt cops. But I wanted to go back to what Jim was talking about, just my selfish interest with this character, Charles Lawton in Les Miserables. And the whole movie was about how harsh the judicial system in France was towards people, putting them in debtor prison, not recognizing that people have to be, that have to live. And if they act out of a necessity to maintain their existence or their families, that's got to be considered, at least we would consider that now. Then any good reason they have for locking you up or putting you in the guillotine, they'll take it. So did you saw that movie, I'm sure. And you remember, how harsh Charles Lawton was towards Frederick March. And I thought that was a point of saying, fuck the police, fuck this authoritarian, cold-hearted. It's no good. Then you remember, anybody else see that movie besides me? I'm not that old. It's a 1935 movie.
I've seen all the versions, so including the musical version. But yeah,
What was? How did they portray the character that was coming after him in the musical version?
Well, basically the same way. He's an obsessive character. It's an obsession with him. I don't think that they portrayed it as. Sometimes they infer that it's systemic, but again, it's always done as an historical. It's very rarely, maybe a little bit more in recent adaptations, is there an analogy made to present day or what we've gone through in this century or something. It's basically he's the antagonist, but he's he's not representative usually of anything else. He's just an individual antagonist.
Okay, so there's another TV series that's very popular. It's been off the air, but they're starting it again. And it's about a police worker, not necessarily a policeman, officer, Dexter. Was a serial killer, but he's limited because his father was in the police department, his adoptive father. And he says, well, you have this thing about killing people. I know the profile and that you're a serial killer. So what we have to do for you to live with this is you're going to have to find and kill serial killers. So it's a good plot point, and from that they've had like I guess, 5 or 6 years of successful TV, and women really love that program because they like the guy who's playing Dexter. And, he's just killing people in a very torturous manner. He's not like just shooting them or giving them poison. He ties them up, cuts them up and everything.
That's a totally sick show.
Well, I know, but it's very popular.
Well, I know,
So-
but see, we haven't even talked about like if you watch Netflix.
And he's a police officer. He's a police employee.
Yeah, I know. The whole thing's ridiculous. It's the serial killer made into a hero. It's just really strange.
Right.
But if you look at the movies that are done, the very popular telenovelas done in Mexico or Brazil, the ones about the cartels, and in all those movies, they're dealing with corrupt politicians and cops. And these are hugely popular in Latin America. I remember watching the one about, it's what's his something of the sky, the Lord of the Sky or something like that. But it was 90 episodes. And, they were talking about literally millions of people watch these things. And those are unabashed in talking about the interrelationship between political power and criminal power. Totally interrelated, and they're great entertainment. And what are they based on? Reality of what goes on in the politics of these countries. Another thing that we haven't talked about is movies like, let's say a movie like Cool Hand Luke. Now, could you say that that's about police corruption? I don't know, but it's certainly about the inequities of the prison, the prison system, and it's also about the triumph of the human spirit. Because what does he do all the time, Paul Newman? He basically escapes, and then they finally kill him and shoot him. So, but he triumphs in his death over the corrupt system, even though he's dead. I mean, I don't know what kind of triumph is that, but and I'm thinking of another film that I thought that did do well at the box office, and that's Papillion about Devil's Island. And that film was a great film about them basically spoofing and escaping from Devil's Island and, down there in the French Guiana. So there's all these things that deal with corruption in different ways that may beyond what the thing. And Michael, there was actually a film called Corruption a pre-code film called Corruption, starring Preston Foster, where he's elected by the criminal machine. And and then he discovers that he was put into power by the criminal machine, and he decides to rebel against them. So that's sort of a theme of Depression films.
I remember the film. There were occasional films like that, pre-code, usually pre-code. The problem is that, and in other words, as far as prison corruption, Papillon and Cool Hand Luke obviously dealt with that, but as far as I think we're supposed to be talking about police, specifically police brutality and corruption. Again, it's there are those those films that really buck the tide and wind up setting a precedent. But the problem with films, obviously, is they're going to cater to the sentiments of the audience at that time. So that's why, like in the late 60s, early 70s, you have the films like Serpico and Prince of the City, the Sidney Lumet, counterpoints to about police corruption, both based on real stories. But then you have the Dirty Harrys, films, the vigilante films, of course, in which the police have to go after the vigilante, but they do it begrudgingly, like Death Wish or whatever. So it depends upon which audience they're catering to. Those films that are just done to make money. It depends upon who's making it and what the intent of the filmmaker is. Is it to do something artistic and tell the truth, or is it to play what the studio game and just say, hey, whatever the audience wants at that time, the bulk of the audience, whatever is the easiest way to make a buck. That's the way to do it too. Again, I think in this particular instance, as far as police brutality and corruption, with the exception of a few films, the few films I mentioned, I think by and large, most of the films are more driven by events outside of the film industry, by actual events. What happened with George Floyd will obviously be a driver of how Hollywood depicts this issue. We mentioned the civil rights movie.
All right. All right. Well, but see, here's where, okay. I would say that some of these movies that we're talking about, let's look at a film like I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, done in 1932 with Paul Muni. That had a greater impact than Serpico did, frankly, for its time, because it was showing the depiction of Southern chain gangs and the prison system. And, movies like The Big House with Robert Montgomery, another film done in 1930 that had another big impact. But I would say probably, going back to I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, showing the corruption and the injustice of the criminal justice system, with Muni basically playing a World War I veteran who's a hobo and basically is in a homeless shelter and essentially winds up in the 10 years sentenced to a chain gang. So that film, I think, films like that had a tremendous impact.
There was another one with Edward G. Robinson, a similar story, where he finally escapes and proves he's innocent, but he was in a chain gang. Remember?
Right. But then, the issue of the reaction in the public and this, of course, sort of takes us in a different direction. The reaction to Little Caesar, The Public Enemy, Scarface in the early, because then the codes come back and really attack these films. They're attacked by Herbert Hoover as essentially encouraging crime. And in those movies, the cops are depicted as docile co-conspirators with the criminals in all those movies, Little Caesar, Public Enemy, and Scarface. So anyway.
Oh yeah, how many movies have we seen where the gangster says, we paid the cops off, they shouldn't be here tonight,
But those films like I Am a Fugitive, which did have a tremendous impact. Again, but what happened is for lack of a better term, powers that be, and then said, okay, we've got to counteract that, and then you have the code come in, and the idea that no, you couldn't say anything negative about the cops, or if you said something, it could be about individual cops, or it could be about, or it would have to come out, looking good for the police at the end. Basically, that's what I'm saying. That the push and pull. It depends upon, in other words, you can get a bold new film, but then somebody will react to it and say, okay, wait a second, we've got to put a cap on this. Or you'll just have, as you did in the 70s, films that take the other side, the question and say, no, we need the police to be able to do things like this, because otherwise we can't keep crime down. So it's, again, push and pull. And the individual films, again, I mentioned them earlier.
West Side Story, etc. I just want to clean up one or two things.
You overemphasize West Side Story, Mike. I don't see that.
Yeah, I know, but hold it a minute. I gotta do a little house cleaning here. Very important.
We can't hear you, Kenny. You're muted.
Oh boy, the audience was saved from those nasty words I was just saying. I just want to clean up a few things. Steve McQueen, the character in Papillon, he escaped twice. Once he escaped successfully, and then a nun turned him in and said, well, if you're innocent, God will let you go, So he spent another 20 years in jail or whatever on Devil's Island. And then as an old man, he escaped for a second time. And then he got back to France and he wrote the book, and he was very happy. And you see a picture, he's in the end of the movie. The actual guy shows up at the end of the movie, and you see the tattoo he has on his chest of a butterfly, which is that's the word papillon. So he escaped twice, and he was successful. And the other thing was, Jim, this is important, being an avid consumer, where do you watch these Covellas or these gangster movies? How do you find them?
They're on Netflix.
Okay.
They're on Netflix. They're quite amazing to watch because they're very popular and they're more crazy in plots than the average American soap.
Right.
Because usually the hero is the big narco trafficante guy, and he basically screwing all the beautiful women. He's screwing. In some cases, he seduces unknowingly the lead attorney who's trying to prosecute his cartel and stuff like that. I mean, they're crazy, but so
it's entertaining.
Well, yeah, but what's interesting is that they're reflecting. They wouldn't be so popular unless these people are experiencing. We don't have to tell anybody all the crazy stuff that goes on down in Mexico with the drug cartels and throughout Latin America, certainly in Colombia. So it's like, and that's something interesting too. Like, let's look at the movies about Pablo Escobar, which have to do with an international dimension of that. And Americans, of course, are the good guys coming in. But when you look at these movies where they're depicting their relationship, they're buying off all the politicians. They control the cops. They lose control if they screw up, all that. So anyway.
Okay, so we're coming to the end time-wise because
Ken,
and we want to go. Mike, just before you go, I wanted to give Dennis a chance to speak. Then I'll come back to you.
Go to Dennis in 10 seconds.
Go ahead. Whoops, I muted you by mistake. Unmute yourself.
One point of information about Papillon is that his accounts have been called into question. It doesn't mean that they're not true, but they've been called into question over the years since then, whether or not he was, everything he said was as it happened. But I just thought I'd put that in as a point of information. Doesn't mean you have to believe one way or the other.
Well, my real name isn't Ken Aaron either, We all have a little bit. We all have secrets. But I mean, he was in the end of the film, so he was a free man, and maybe he made up a story. But he did get off of Devil's Island, so he had the last laugh. Okay, let's go to Dennis. Dennis, what's your ending viewpoint on the influence or the censorship of the movie industry of talking about corruption and brutality in the police force? Come on, Dennis. Unmute yourself. Let's see if we can get Dennis to say something. And I think I've thought of, while we're waiting for Dennis, our next program in a week, I think we should discuss why people go to the movies or watch movies. What is the motivation? Michael's talking about, the revelation of truth or something. And, Dennis, James has brought up the fact that people are basically looking for spectator sensation. I can honestly have no problem with it. I could sit and watch highlight reels of people catching passes or people, what they call Jack running, avoiding the tackle, and just watch that all day. It's, the manifestation of human competence, or people pole vaulting. It's sensation. It's got nothing to do with the truth or righteousness or anything. It's just observing it. And sometimes they call that eye candy. So we should discuss and do the research to find out, generally speaking, what are most people or what degree of people are motivated to go into the movies for whatever time. So it's a good question, right? So
it's a big subject. You might want to be a little bit more specific, because that could be a 4-parter.
Yeah. Well, okay, we'll take a look at that. Why people go to the movie and who they are. Does it vary? Of course, it's going to vary by gender and age, and maybe by race or nationality. So let's bring this show to an end. And in order to do that, I am going to run my little clip at the end here and then close off the YouTube and the recording. But let me first run my little clip. And I go like this, and here it comes. This is for the movies, right? Okay, outro for the movies. There it is. Okay, so hopefully you guys see this and hear it. Okay, everybody. Signing off. See you next time. And let's stop the recording. Oh, okay, the recording stopped. Anybody want to say anything before we close the
Yeah.
session?
First of all, I'm glad you put our names in alphabetical order. That way you could get top billing. That was the real purpose of it. No,
all right.
as far as next week goes, you should, you got to hone that down a little bit. That's a massive. Why do people go to the movies?
Yeah.
Could take hours to discuss, but you might find something more specific out of that.
Well, I know specifically on my own history, it's like when I'll save the story for the episodes. But yeah, I think a little bit of research will reveal a lot, because people who get paid by universities or governments to do social science investigations survey everything. They experiment with everything and survey everything to figure out what people's motivation is, because that's a very important thing to the industry. Why are people paying money to go to the theater or download something? What are they watching, and why are they watching it? Why do women watch Downton Abbey? I didn't mean Downton Abbey's very good, but it's or one of my wife's favorite is the something of the midwives, Call the Midwives, another British flick. Everybody's very proper. Nobody actually moves their heads; they just move their lower lips. And it's all very British. These British series going on and on. That's another topic. Another topic is how come there's such an invasion of British actors and actresses in American film? They're all over the place.
Well, there's a reason for that I can give you, is because they're usually better trained. At least nowadays.
Maybe they use less drugs or something, so they're more reliable.
They use a lot of alcohol. But the fact is that, no, I think that if you can get it cut down to something like, do people, to what degree do people get their knowledge of the real world from the movies?
That's a totally different subject. That's a totally different subject. In other words, do people go to the all right, that's one of the options. People go to the movies to get informed, to actually learn something. You don't go to see Star Wars to get informed. Or maybe you do to go see that movie about the priest pedophiles. I forgot what it's called, so you get a movie like that, or All the President's Men, or maybe even Lincoln was kind of educational. They used to make a lot of biographical pictures. I can't think of one. I don't even know which was the last one. But I remember growing up, it was always Mickey Rooney or Frederick March or Paul Muni. And they would be doing, the life of Dreyfus or Thomas Edison or Louis Pasteur, right? You'd see these great movies which were educational and inspirational. But I haven't seen another ones like that. Oh, one of the last ones was July 4th. That's not the name of the movie. Tom Cruise did it about
Born on the 4th of July.
Born on the 4th of July. Yeah, that was a biographical.
That was several years ago. I think Lincoln came after that.
Well, Lincoln wasn't biographical. Lincoln started, he's already president.
No, it's biographical. It just was limited in its biography, but it's a biographical film.
Okay.
The fact is that, you had all these biographical films, so people, but as far as why people go to the movies, why they went in the 30s is different from why they went in the 40s, which is different from why they went in the 50s.
Right.
In any period, the reasons change. I mean, when I was a kid, my parents nobody took the movies that seriously. I mean, the Academy Awards were not this ratings buster that they are today.
That they used to be 3 years ago.
That they used to be, but I'm saying that they were in recent years. I mean, when I was a kid, most people didn't watch the Academy Awards. They couldn't care less.
Right.
The movies served their purpose, and that was it. Nowadays, the movies seem to serve a greater purpose for people. As people always said, used to tell me, they said, Mike, you used to go to the movies all the time. You know all about these movies. What happened? I said, I grew up. And they said, well, what about everybody else? I said, they grew down. What can I say? Anyway,
Okay.
are you coming on the show tonight?
Yeah, 5:30. I sent this in the invitation.
Yeah, you did, I believe. Well, I don't know.
So
I
I've got to stop now because I've got to try to rewind this video that we just did, or before we start the next one.
And I'm not going to get on till 8:45 at this point. I got things I got to do before.
Okay, go do it. Go for it. 8:45.
Right.
Okay, right. Great. Good enough.
Okay.
We'll see you then.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.